Welcome back to the Conservation as a Land Use session. We have 3 exciting talks this afternoon to complement the talks that we've seen this morning already. The first talk is going to be held by Marie Pratzer from Humboldt University. And I'm not going to read your title because you probably want to say something about it yourself. Marie, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Tobias, and hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So this morning we've already heard several implications of considering conservation as a land use, and I would like to suggest that this perspective sheds light on at least 3 major concerns. First, conservation is an expanding land use. Ambitious global area targets are being formulated, such as here in the Montreal Biodiversity Conference in 2022, which means that the importance of area-based conservation is going to increase in nearly all landscapes across the globe. Second, however, almost all global land that is available is already used, either actively managed or providing more subtle benefits, which means that conservation will rarely expand over residual or empty lands. And that means that conservation planning has to consider its role in the tightening global competition for land, and even more importantly, engage with the land uses that are taking place and the people present in landscapes of high conservation value. And third, this is particularly challenging because conservation target setting and action often take place on very different scales that are poorly linked. Such as here, you can see 2 Bolivian conservationists in the Chiquitano forest whose reality might not be perfectly reflected in international decision-making arenas. So I would say that these concerns are very important for both just and effective conservation, and they translate into concrete challenges. To reach area targets, we need spatial planning, which in the end often means prioritizing certain areas for conservation action. To deal with the fact that all land is already used by someone, providing benefits to someone, we need data on the social-ecological complexity on the ground. And finally, to translate global targets into regional initiatives and action on the ground, we need frameworks or tools that address this gap between scales. But then, how do we cover all the complexity of these multiple dimensions? To respond to this challenge, we developed a land system typology for conservation planning that represents the diversity of land uses in a scalable way. Let me explain this to you in more detail. So, spatial planning relies on data, on the complexity on the ground. And in order to be most meaningful from a biodiversity conservation point of view, we need data on the threats to biodiversity that come with certain land uses. We need data on the opportunities for conservation that also arise from certain land uses, such as opportunities for coexistence of wildlife and people, but also leverage points for making certain land use practices more biodiversity friendly. And third, very importantly, of course, we need data on the actors and related social implications of conservation. That leaves us with the challenge of how to represent these different levels that come here. And we applied an archetyping approach. So archetyping means structuring social-ecological complexity by depicting recurrent human-environment interaction. And in other words, it is like the goal is to find a level of generalization that allows us to retain as much of the specificity of context and cases, but at the same time also generalize so that we can derive information or identify patterns that are useful for more broad-scale planning or sustainability planning more generally. And in our case, we try to structure land uses into land systems. So we understand land systems as distinct combinations of major types of land use actors and their activities, which produce typical landscapes that then translate into threats to biodiversity on the one hand, but also opportunities for conservation. Let me give you an example. One of such land systems could be agribusiness cropping. that typically produces agricultural landscapes dominated by homogeneous large-scale crop fields. And a typical threat could come from agrochemical pollution, and conservation opportunity could be addressing supply chains and introducing supply chain regulations. A very different land system could be forest-dependent people who use the forest for grazing might potentially degrade the forest through overgrazing, and conservation opportunities could come from formalizing land rights, who these actors often don't have, thereby encouraging sustainable resource use and measures such as zoning. But then, what is the appropriate level of abstraction? What is the appropriate level of abstraction when we think about these land systems? And that's super tricky, because as I've said, conservation planning often happens at broad spatial scales, or research often looks at habitats or entire ecoregions, such as in our case, where we are concerned about tropical dry woodlands worldwide. It's an ecoregion that is highly threatened, but receives comparable little attention, especially compared to tropical rainforests, although it's very biodiverse, has been inhabited for millennia, is culturally diverse, and provides livelihoods to millions, hundreds of millions of people. So, therefore, we developed a typology of land systems that we can find across tropical dry woodland regions, and where we think it can inform broad-scale planning, and hopefully also be useful for regional comparison and potentially cross-regional learning. But then, as I've also said earlier, these global scale tools or frameworks, they are often not useful for actual conservation planning on the ground, because they don't capture the regional specificities and the context. Therefore, we complemented this general global level of the typology with a regionalized level that is more tailored to the social-ecological context of a specific region. And we hope that this can actually be useful for conservation planners, inform more regional initiatives, capture more of the regional nuance. And we did this regionalization task for 5 focus regions, the dry Chaco, dry forests in Argentina, Bolivia, Mozambique, India, and Cambodia. How did we do this? We relied heavily upon expert knowledge. So that means specifically we organized more than 12 expert workshops with more than 50 experts. And experts here means scientists, mostly land system scientists, conservationists, and also a few practitioners. I'm happy to give more detail about the methodology in the Q&A. Now let me present you the result. So this is the general level global typology consisting of 15 land systems that cover a range of more large-scale capitalized agriculture to more smallholder farming. Then we also have land systems that are often overlooked or underrepresented, such as pastoralist or forest-dwelling land systems. We have forestry systems, and we also consider conservational land use, and so we have 3 conservation land systems differentiating among state, private, and community conservation. And then, as I've said, we regionalized this typology, and what you can see here is the regionalization for the Argentine Chaco, where, for example, cattle ranching is one of the most important and most widespread land uses. Therefore, we split this global land system into 3 ones to retain more of the regional nuance. And finally, we did this for all 5 regions, as I've said. Let me take a closer look at the conservation land systems. So here, so in general, it was very interesting to find similar patterns across regions, but also some land systems that were really specific to a certain region. For the conservation land systems, we found that the state is in general the most powerful and important actor, but then the levels of restriction and governance varied. Private conservation was prevalent in some regions, often linked to tourism. In Mozambique, for example, often private and state conservation were very entangled. Land is owned by the state, but often protected areas are co-managed by private actors that are either NGOs or companies specialized in safari or hunting tourism. Community conservation looked very differently. Also, we had indigenous reserves in Bolivia, for example, communal forestry in different regions, and also sacred sites. And this effort led to a publication, and I just want to highlight the huge teamwork that this was. Now, I know I don't have much time left. I just want to give a quick outlook on the next step, because obviously for this typology to be useful for planning, it had to be mapped. And here again, we used an expert-based approach that allowed us, bottom-up approach that allowed us to map these land systems as overlapping, which is super important if we consider the contested nature and multiple claims that characterize land use in many regions, but also if we consider conservational land use, because we can now map these land uses without hiding other activities taking place in these landscapes. And indeed, as we map the land systems, they overlap. So here you can see darker shades of red showing more than one land system mapped. And if we zoom in to look at the overlaps of conservation and other land uses, here differentiating in turquoise small scale and in brown the industrialized land uses, we see that these overlaps or co-occurrences happen in many cases, which highlights the importance of considering this interaction in conservation planning, because these overlaps can lead to co-benefits in the best case, but of course also to trade-offs and conflict. In short, our land systems managed to put on our land system typology put on the map a lot of social-ecological complexity that is often overlooked. Our typology highlighted both commonalities and differences across regions and shed light on the opportunities but also limits of cross-regional learning. And our systems overlap, so it's very important to consider these co-occurring land systems in conservation planning. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marie. Questions to Marie?
Great presentation, thank you. Just in light of the discussions we have having and thinking of your last exercise of mapping conservation and industrialized agriculture, I guess, or some kind of, would you say that in this case conservation is a land use? Is there still a land use of conservation happening there? Or, sorry for the more provocative question.
Yeah, so we've had a heated debate over lunch, under which conditions we can consider a protected area a land use or not. If the protected area is more of a paper park, is it then a conservation land use or not? So, yeah, it's a very challenging question to answer. But I think in most cases, conservation areas do have some spatial footprint or the governance that is linked to it that makes it very important to consider it, even if it does not translate into very strict protection or what we might in the first moment link to the notion of protected areas.
I'm going to apologize. I had to step out of the earlier part to go see a colleague, collaborator. But I wanted to ask, in all this work, did you consider, as a counterpoint, resource concessions? Because it's reminiscent of a lot of work I did, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, on mineral hydrocarbon concessions, which I can't remember if I called it a land use or a land imperative, as a claim, spatially explicit but not tied directly to explicit change in land cover. I thought that's a helpful comparison to protected areas. But of course, conservation can occur outside, just like mining can occur outside. Yeah. So I just wanted to ask, and with an apology if it's been discussed.
No, I mean, you mean the case when there are concessions or when land is zoned or so for a specific purpose, but it does not really translate into management on the ground, how we would deal with this.
Yes, or if it does, it's only within a portion of the extent. Other cover types can be seen, uses can be found within those extents. And I'll just say in that work, where we did a study of Peru, and we found all sorts of overlaps between these kind of land imperatives for natural protected areas, indigenous territories, and hydrocarbon concessions, sometimes all three. It's different government bodies making decisions, making claims, expressing preferences, and certain government bodies have more power, I guess, namely the ones around resources.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
yeah. This was a tricky thing that mostly came up when I was now mapping these land systems. I only did this for 2 of our study regions. I forgot to mention that. Only for the South American 2 ones. Yeah, I mean we relied because we used a lot of or like some data that was actually like 10-year data or like land use zoning plan or so, and we relied a bit on the knowledge of our of our collaborators who like from that region to tell us which of these concessions we should actually consider as a land system and map there, and which ones are more like in some document that will never materialize or that have no relevance or so. But yeah, very good question.
I feel a bit sorry that you have to justify what I presented in the first talk, which is fine. Yeah, but I think the parallel is a good parallel that you're making. In a sense, I guess one of the things that I try to highlight is that when we think about agriculture and about a map of agriculture, we would refer to agriculture as places where agriculture actually happens. But when we have a map of conservation areas, that's not necessarily the case. We don't even know it for the global protected area state, right? Where conservation happens on the ground. And the same would be true for mining concessions. But we might be able to measure that better with satellite images where actually we have mines, right? But to be clear on these distinctions was sort of part of framework that, I'm not sure if we want to call it a framework, but of the idea that we put forward this morning. And now here I think what Marie showed with the land systems would be perhaps to zoom out a little bit more and to say that a place that has mines could have a lot of de facto protected forests because mining is not happening everywhere. And so that system has a conservation value as well. And that could be similar to a protected area that has, some land uses inside because it's a non-strict protected area. So I think it's also a scale issue. But I'm not giving a second talk now, so but I think it's a great point. Okay, we are moving to the second talk. Yeah, that's.
Okay, thanks everyone. Oh, yeah, thanks Marie also.
Thanks Marie. I'm going to introduce you, Marie. So our next talk is by Millie Chapman, soon to be a member of ETH soon. Is that okay? Fair to say? Yes. Yeah. It's on the slide. Yeah, I didn't know it, but it was official yet. So ETH too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to present some of my work from my PhD, which ended a year ago now. That this is still some work in review. Thinking about EU biodiversity targets, so conservation and restoration targets in the context of changing land use demands under climate mitigation scenarios. So just to frame this a little bit, we've already talked a bunch about the Kunming-Montréal Global Biodiversity Framework, which outlines a bunch of charismatic targets like 30 by 30, restoring 30% of degraded lands, but also kind of explicitly outlines targets for the need to do this in strategic and spatially planned ways. Of course, these targets aren't implemented on global scales, but rather implemented by national jurisdictions and even subnational jurisdictions and local policies. Just to step back to kind of frame this in a methodological sense, I guess. So there's obviously decades of work on conservation planning, and increasingly a lot of work on restoration planning, and increasingly a lot of information on changing production demands into the future. But we're often doing this all kind of naive to one another. So we plan restoration, not considering conservation, and not necessarily considering production, and how all of these land use actions are actually synergistic with one another. So I guess in theory, we should be planning these all in concert to have the most kind of coherent landscapes. And so this is kind of the methodological idea of some of the work that I've been doing in the EU. Why the EU? For a couple of reasons, partially because their policies are really well aligned with these global targets. They have a commitment to protecting 30% of lands, and a recently signed nature restoration law, which has committed the EU to restoring 20% of lands also over the next decade. And simultaneously, the EU also has kind of ambitious climate mitigation targets, the Fit for 55 package, which also has a lot of kind of like land use implications. So a lot of increased bioenergy demands, which are going to potentially be in conflict with some of these biodiversity targets. So some of the questions we're going to ask are, where will conservation and restoration maximize benefits to biodiversity contributions and climate mitigation? Are these targets actually in conflict with changing production demands and climate mitigation targets? And how much will things like burden sharing between countries actually shift the overall potential of these policies to actually meet their underlying objectives of mitigating biodiversity loss, reducing biodiversity loss and mitigating climate change? Okay, so briefly in the methods, kind of the formal question is this question of where should we invest in conservation and restoration? First, we need to start with some initial conditions. So we use 100-meter land cover data across the EU. We aggregate this to 10-kilometer by 10-kilometer planning units or decision units for a number of reasons. But within each of these planning units, we keep track of how much of that planning unit is forest, how much of it is grassland, how much of it is agriculture of different intensities, and how much of each of those land covers are inside and outside of legal protection. So we don't want to expand intensive agriculture into an area that's already protected, which is kind of the notion of keeping track of legal delineations. And we have 16 land cover classes, again, different intensities of agriculture as well as kind of natural landscapes. If anyone's understands math better than figures, it's up for you, but don't sweat it otherwise. The gist is we're making decisions in each of these planning units. P, we can restore some forests, we could restore some grassland, we could reduce the intensity of cropland. Again, there are 25 different management measures, which are those 16 land cover classes, plus the notion that we can restore different land covers, which is distinct from kind of maintaining an existing land use. Of course, we need to keep track of how this impacts biodiversity and climate mitigation in each of these different planning units. So for instance, this is a forest-dwelling bird. If we restore a forest within that bird's range, we're contributing to its habitat, presumably, whereas if we restore a forest outside, that is not contributing to this individual species kind of area of habitat. We do this for all of the species of concern in the EU, as well as keep track of how different land management changes will impact above, below, and soil organic carbon. We do this across all of these different land management options and across all of the 41,000 or so planning units to come as close as possible to a set of area-based targets for all of these individual species, as well as climate mitigation targets on the landscape. We, of course, need to weight our targets. There's a lot of values kind of entrenched in this problem, and we want to sum over all of our targets. Of course, we need to subject this to our area-based policy targets, as well as to meeting our changing production demands. And so for setting these production demands, I worked with a group at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis to look at how bioeconomy demands are likely to change into 2030, which is when these area-based conservation and restoration targets are set to be met. And we do that under two different scenarios. So under this reduced emission Fit for 55 scenario across the EU, as well as for a business as usual scenario. We also set a bunch of land transition constraints, again, to ensure that we're not proposing some really outrageous transitions in the landscape. We can throw this into an optimization algorithm and come up with some cute solutions. We can see our restoration priorities, our conservation priorities, our production priorities. These are all broken down by different land cover types, which allow us to keep kind of more refined track of the implications of these potential futures on biodiversity and climate mitigations. We can see our urban areas are still there, where we might have production, where conservation not being protection necessarily, but the maintenance of natural land cover areas, where we might have our best bets for restoring natural landscapes as well as reducing the intensity of agricultural landscapes. In and of itself, those spatial priorities are actually not all that useful. What I think is useful about formalizing this problem is that we can think about the implications of things like our objectives or of our values. Do we care about biodiversity? Do we care about climate mitigation? Do we care about other dimensions of the outcomes of these policies? We can think about different scenarios of policy implementation, of responsibility or burden sharing between countries, and of different futures of production demands. So you can see here just the production scenarios that we use, and you can see that under kind of some of these high emissions reductions scenarios, there's increases in the demand for forestry production and a few other things. These are all broken down by subnational jurisdictions, again, to make sure that we're not proposing some massive redistribution of the bioeconomy across the EU. So this is our 2020 landscape. I'm just showing a biodiversity axis of the outputs of these policies. Without the nature restoration law, meeting these increased production demands is likely to have kind of a negative impact on biodiversity as a whole. But we show in this paper that investment in the nature restoration law and implementation of it strategically can kind of reverse this trend that we're likely to see under these increased production demands. These are two different scenarios of the implementation of the nature restoration law. That's super important. But in any case, both of them show kind of increases in species targets that are met. We can explore, again, things like values, so how much we care about carbon versus biodiversity, how that changes kind of the overall outcomes of these policies or the potentials of these policies to meet their underlying objectives, as well as kind of how these different implementations might shift these curves, in different solutions. I'm going to blast through some of the results because they're not super critical. Again, we can look at the impacts of burden sharing. In this case, we show that actually redistribution of these area-based biodiversity targets between countries doesn't actually provide huge benefits to biodiversity. This is partially an artifact of the ways in which EU policy outlines the ways in which we account for species habitat targets, which are at country and biome scales. And so it kind of all comes out in the wash. But in any case, you can see the benefits that can be realized by increased burden sharing. One of the main takeaways, I think, from this analysis is not all of those figures and kind of the ins and outs of the spatial solutions, but rather that spatial planning across targets, across management measures, and across land uses, not thinking about conservation and restoration as kind of distinct land use processes removed from these production landscapes, really changes what we think of as priorities for investment in these biodiversity policies. Not only kind of spatially, where we would prioritize something like restoration, but also across restoration measures, how much we might want to invest in de-intensification of agriculture versus some other kind of restoration measure. Another thing is it can overestimate the feasibility of restoration policy when we think about these things kind of distinct from the rest of the land use system. There's a preprint on all of this because I rushed over a bunch of details, so if you're interested, check it out. A bunch of next steps that I don't have time to go into. And just want to say that what I'm thinking about a lot now is the underlying data disparities that go into kind of these algorithmic solutions to policy implementation and to our understanding of the potential impacts of policy implementation. So underlying all of this is a huge amount of biodiversity data, and that data is incredibly disparate along social and political dimensions. We throw that into a bunch of algorithms, which are also very political, and we come up with decisions or decision support systems that are likely to entrench a lot of the biases that have existed historically. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you, Millie. Questions? First one.
Great presentation, Melissa. I was wondering, so a lot of the ways in which countries, especially in the north of Europe, are trying to tackle or to get to these targets is through voluntary incentives. So voluntary schemes, especially for afforestation, right? In Denmark, that's a big thing, for example. And they might get to the mitigation ones, but of course, if you tell landowners to set aside land from their farms for conservation, for afforestation, you do not get the same biodiversity benefits, even if you try to make it diverse. You don't have the corridors, you don't have other things, right? Is that something that could feed into potential next steps? Because the ways to address them do not necessarily follow this prioritization logic, right? So you have to go into the volunteering schemes too, and where it's hard to prioritize at the national level.
Yeah, that's a fabulous point. There are, I think, a couple of points in there that I think are really, really important next steps. The first of which is that, yeah, of course, these are kind of like top-down looks at the like potential of policies and not necessarily their like feasible implementations. And then there's this whole other element that a huge amount of investment in these biodiversity targets is incredibly opportunistic. Right, like you can't tell a landowner what to do, but you can like create incentive schemes such that like maybe there are places where these investments are happening or where restoration of different land uses is occurring, but you can't necessarily like plan that optimally like we do in this analysis. I don't have a good answer for you, but I think that there are some like fun ideas around like integrating like uncertainty into all of these sorts of analyses, like how much does uncertainty in like where these investments may or may not happen like change entirely the potential outcomes of these policies and our understanding of those outcomes, as well as kind of these notions of burden sharing between countries, that there's very different voluntary markets in different jurisdictions, partially as a result of like historic land tenure and or like other factors that exist heterogeneously across the landscape, and so consideration of that would be really interesting as well. So, I'll stop there, but yeah.
More questions? Rachael? Did you want to ask a question? Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, it's amazing work that you're doing. Obviously, like a huge amount of great analysis going in there. I've always had a problem with this word prioritization. And I know you've probably thought about it because it seems to be in the data justice aspect. But just, yeah, like prioritizing according to what objectives, so according to what policies, values, all that stuff. Why continue to even use that word, I guess? And then relatedly, there's an issue about scale and connectivity. And so, like doing all these things simultaneously across the landscape versus focusing in certain areas at a time where their connectivity. How does that figure into this, to meeting these targets? Like, are there economies of scale? Are there lower benefits if you do it in a more disaggregated way versus a more, I don't know. So all that stuff about land sparing and land sharing is in there as well.
Yeah, no, I'll answer your second point first. That's a fabulous point, and I think some of the next steps for this work. So part of that is that it's really hard to deal with these issues of connectivity and like including that in any of these sorts of analyses when you do that first step of aggregating the fine scale land cover data up to 10-kilometer data, because you're already abstracting all of those sort of like fine scale habitat dynamics. And so that is just like really for computational convenience, but not necessarily like a requirement of these algorithms. And also, I think that there's, a lot of cool work that could be done on kind of exploring some of these other ecological like notions of like more effective solutions. Your point about prioritization is incredibly well taken. I think I don't even know if I use the term prioritization in the actual paper because of this controversy. But I, of course, was maybe problematically trained in this like whole long history of prioritization, and so the term still rolls off the tongue. But I think that there is, I think what I wanted to try to emphasize, and I didn't get to talk about the results in detail, is that like by formalizing these problems, we can actually kind of start to tease apart some of these questions of like how these policies are implemented, which values are entrenched, all these sorts of things, and how those change what would be a priority or a potential future landscape. And so, I think these are really interesting and important points to talk about as a community.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Millie. Next talk is going to be by Carsten Meyer.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, I'd like to start by apologizing. hasn't been everybody's week with recent events in the US, etc. Also hasn't been my week. So over the past 2 weeks, wonderful analyses ran on our cluster, but internet connectivity over the last day actually prevented me from accessing those data. And now my computer died, and that's fine. I'm just going to give a short talk. So the title would have been Who Controls the Land, or the lands that have been identified as conservation and restoration priorities. And we explored this question using a case study with Brazil. Brazil is wonderful in the sense that it provides open access parcel level land tenure data, so 7 million parcels roundabout. And basically through rather basic overlay analyses of these different land tenure regimes, and also sort of some associated metrics, for example, the average size of properties, the number of properties involved in a particular case, overlaying that with identified conservation priorities. We wanted to explore some questions about justice, but also some questions about feasibility. So I think you can think of this both from the conservation and from sort of the more social science perspective. We are, of course, fully aware that global maps of conservation priorities, they are politically very delicate, they're highly controversial. In most countries, fortunately, they are largely ignored when it comes to on-the-ground conservation work. However, countries do their own conservation and also their own conservation planning. And Brazil is such a case. There is actually an official map of conservation priorities from Brazil that has been developed under leadership of the environmental ministry. And there is even a Brazilian law that requires the state to do conservation in these identified conservation priorities. So it's, I would say, from a legislative perspective, pretty strong. It has been, I would say, more or less inclusive process to develop these conservation priorities, but obviously many factors have not been considered. There's a tendency in our community to do whataboutism. There's a conservation map, there's a particular study, people try to identify something with a very clear objective, and we say, oh, but you didn't consider this. So yes, that's of course true, but usually these sort of broad-scale conservation priorities, they are not designed, or they're not meant to inform large-scale on-the-ground action. They're informed to point to direction where more specific contextualized actions would need to happen. And in this Brazilian case, this is partially reflected because for each of these different conservation priorities in the country, they identify different sort of priority actions that are supposedly adequate for that system. Now I say supposedly because, of course, you cannot consider everything. And land tenure regimes, in particular, were only insofar considered that existing protected areas were considered. And one of the things that became clear is just the vastness of the task of actually dealing with stakeholders. So the CBD is actually, I would say it's not too classical conservation here in this sense, because more important, in my opinion, than the goal to this 30 by 30 goal is the goal that says that all lands should be under biodiversity inclusive, integrated spatial planning. And the spatial planning can be for all kinds of actions. It can be for area-based conservation, it can be for other things. And I find it, I think we have to sort of cut the CBD some slack, that they say biodiversity inclusive rather than saying biodiversity guided or something like that, and emphasize the integrative. Now, they also say participatory spatial planning, and that's actually a biggie, because in Brazil, even if you zoom into relatively small areas that have been identified as conservation priorities, these still overlap with thousands, in some cases millions of properties, typically sort of in the low 10 to 100,000s. And what type of participatory process should that be, where you actually try to sort of align interests of 100,000 people? It would likely ultimately boil down to something like elected representatives making decisions. Maybe with some advice from a council or so, but it would certainly not consider the needs of every one of these landholders that would be affected by policies. the also would have been able to show you some things about sort of power relations. You find that in some parts of Brazil, there is extreme imbalance in the types of landowners that are sort of affected by conservation and that are expected to carry some of the conservation burden. So in some cases you have very few extremely large landholders, presumably wealthy, otherwise they wouldn't have so much land, and a whole bunch of small-scale smallholders. In such situations, you can expect that in any, however, participatory process, obviously some people would have a greater say simply because they have more leverage. They hold more land that is needed, so they have a better position to dictate how exactly this conservation on the ground will happen. And now coming more to the conservation perspective, if in many cases you're dealing with so many stakeholders, it implies extreme transaction costs if you actually want to come to any sort of meaningful solution on the ground. And also this extreme diversity of stakeholders and this extremely high number of stakeholders actually affects the potential conservation targets, because however you will design policies, whether this will be via top-down regulation that limits private use rights, for example, such as the forest code, or by, extreme measures such as, appropriating land and turning it into a strict protected area, you will never have full compliance, and you will always have some actors who basically, or some parcels that don't work well. And if you think about planning for example, restoration, where connectivity is a big thing, it really matters whether a particular corridor that you think of restoring is dominated by one or two actors with which you might feasibly work, or rather with thousands of actors, where however you design it, it will likely not work. I had one last point. Computer is dead. I think I said enough. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Carsten. Pretty impressive to come up with a slideless presentation on the spot. I'm not sure if everyone would have been able to do that. Questions to Carsten?
Hey, great presentation. My question is in relation to the cost of the land, and if you have seen some differences between areas that are more expensive, let's say, or opportunity cost, and the ones that are less expensive, and if there's differences in the actors or the owners in relation to that axis or.
So yes, of course, that is the case. So a lot of the private owners tend to live in more accessible lands. A lot of the sort of local communities tend to be in more remote areas, so there are some patterns there. Actually, costs of land is one of the socio-economic factors that has been explicitly included in the conservation prioritization scheme in Brazil, but of course the act is affected by that, not directly.
More questions? Rachael?
I wasn't sure I totally understood your point about the whataboutism. Like, it sounded like you were saying we shouldn't be saying what about this and what about that because the studies themselves weren't set up to consider those other things. But my concern is in the science policy communication, the classic case of the Baston et al. Paper where they were like, these are the priorities, yes, under very limited characteristics of what they were considering. And then you had the UN environmental secretary saying, finally, a definitive map of where we should do restoration. So I guess my question is are you trying to imply that we should continue on with this? Okay, so please clarify.
No,
Thank you.
Certainly not. So so maybe I used to extreme ones. So there's a whole number of studies, probably even the majority of conservation planning studies that are guilty of largely ignoring social environmental contexts and just coming up with silver bullet solutions that completely ignore human rights, etc. There are a number of conservation scientists. I think we should also acknowledge those who are very much aware of these issues and who use extremely careful wording, who actually engage in policy processes to make sure that these are not directly turned into conservation priorities. Of course, people like simple messages, so how some, Secretary General then frames that is another question. Even the on-the-ground processes that are conceived to be inclusive and integrative do not consider everything. Not every process can consider everything. And if we're honest, some of the more human rights-oriented processes also don't consider everything. You'd see priority maps of areas for food security interventions. They don't consider biodiversity or climate in these areas. So the point is that ultimately, for actual implementation on the ground, it needs to be as participatory as possible, I would say. We also have to be careful with our expectations there and considerate and multidimensional process, and ideally one that is not fixated on one particular solution, but one that uses the flexibility of conservation approaches, such as, for example, strengthening, state protection or intensifying legal obligations for private landholders. There are all kinds of options. Adapt them to the context, but honestly, this is actually what's happening. There are very few protected areas these days that are being implemented according to some top-down scheme.
Thanks. Of course.
Thanks, that was really interesting. It's not a question, it's just a general comment. I fully agree with you that, obviously kind of more participatory ways of planning would be the ideal. But I want to push back a bit because Brazil is a pretty well-resourced country. It's, I don't know, global south or not, but it's pretty well-resourced, and we clearly have the political will to do these prioritization exercises. My fear, I guess this is ungrounded on anything so far, but my fear is that a lot of global prioritization exercises that particularly are pushed by big international NGOs who have the funding and work directly with in-country partners, so places like Nepal and the Mekong region, they have a lot of say over how conservation is implemented there, and they do influence, they do create protected areas in these countries. So nothing against what you're saying, it's just that, it is contextually different in different countries. And
I can only agree with you. There's a reason why I used a prioritization scheme for this analysis that you cannot see, that is as legitimate as you could possibly think, right? And even that regime still has issues. Obviously, if you start off with some sort of top-down map that was designed in, I don't know, Cambridge, Helsinki, wherever, you don't even start addressing these problems because you're dealing with much more fundamental problems.
Okay, more questions? We have plenty of time for them.
Yeah, really interesting, and I'm particularly interested in this issue of how we solve the problem of having to, or having this ideal of participatory planning for all of these different communities. But the scale of that is very, very large, and it's very hard to imagine how to do that in many ways. And I come to this from work back when I was doing more energy work, which is, ideal world, you have a certain process for community energy projects in, let's say, different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We're looking for electricity access. And you say, okay, well, that's going to take a long time for the community to decide what kind of energy system they want. But you have 100,000 villages that need to do this, right? And you can't. It's very hard to replicate that process all the way through. So I'm just trying to figure out, this is a similar thing where how do you kind of get past that scale issue? And I guess part of the way that people talk about it in the energy world is there may be 100,000 places, but there's not 100,000 different solutions, right? The solution space is much smaller than that, and the solutions in some places are going to look similar to other solutions in other places, and that are other packages of solutions. I don't know that works in this context. I'm just curious as how you get past that issue.
So, I cannot speak for all possible global contexts. I can just imagine how this works out in Brazil. Because of the sheer number of actors involved in areas that are identified as prioritization, there will be no such thing as ground tables or whatsoever. Honestly, we're not having this, in our countries too. We're constantly having decisions that affect individual people's rights, including rights to their private properties. We have election processes, we have democratic processes. We do this basically on a more meta level, institutionally, via voting, etc. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you have some council that's supposedly representative. And I think this will be how most of this scales up. When we think of participatory processes, we always think of, this like some wilderness area where you sit with a couple of people under a tree and you explain something on a map. Like this is not actually the scale. The scale is private lands. The vast majority of all lands in the world are private.
Well, thanks. For me, it was very, very interesting to see your talk. Every time people talk about conservation units in Brazil, the first thing that come to my mind is public land. And there are places in Brazil where public land, they are much smaller in terms of conservation units than private land. The legal reserves in Pantanal are a good example of that. Only 3% of the land in Pantanal are public land. The majority of the land, it's private. In terms of legal reserve. Now, when we talk about privatization, I'm in favor of privatization because that's the way you're going to keep the land in Pantanal. People don't care much about the public land there because it's so small compared to the private one. And what I see there is that the push in terms of the inside of this private land, to transform the private land without incentives. And without incentives, I don't see the conservation units survive in that area. I think that we need to look at different regions because the forest code is for the whole country, but there are so many different areas, specific characteristics that's affected. So I want to see your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so it's true. I would say the vacant state lands, they are actually pretty humongous in Brazil, but they are mostly in areas that are de facto reserves due to the inaccessibility. Areas that are useful for something have been claimed. And even a lot of the areas that are not yet recognized as such are in the process of being recognized or are already occupied by settlements, sometimes for decades. So chances are those will not be, thrown out and the switches be turned into a protected area. It's very unlikely, I think. Most of the areas where most of the biodiversity change has recently happening, in the Cerrado, Northern Cerrado, etc., land is primarily private. And this is, I think, where privatization could come in. You could, for example, identify those are areas of all the areas where we lose natural vegetation, where a lot of biodiversity loss is implied. So maybe we use our limited resources to start experimenting in that area with, for example, more stringent forest codes coupled with some recompensations, etc. So again, it doesn't need to be that you have a formal protected area. In my opinion, the forest code, like however sort of demonized it is actually a pretty amazing tool because it basically outsources the responsibility for conservation from a state government that has very little to do in remote areas anyway to personal individuals that can be held accountable. So this is pretty cool. Yeah, of course, but ultimately the responsibility for the conservation lies with the private person. So if you do not conserve your area, the state knocks on your door and collects a fee. And this is much more effective than expecting the state to do everything. So, like, private lands can be an opportunity in some cases. Of course, there are also problems with it, but more importantly than that, there is no way around them. They are extremely protected constitutionally in almost all countries of the world. And it's actually very hard to limit private rights. So within the little opportunities that you have, like, use that scope. And why not prioritize areas where you start with that? I don't see a big controversial issue there.
Okay, thank you. I'm noting that we had some of the most inspired discussions on a talk that had no slides and was just 5 minutes, so maybe inspiration for the next OSM. We don't show slides anymore. Thank you, Carsten, and thank you all for the questions. And that concludes our session. We are through with the talks here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to all the speakers from this morning and this afternoon, and stay tuned for more on conservation as a land use.